We begin our study today of Psalm 98, which has as a theme that of celebration. Let mountains sing joyfully. And in my introduction in the letter to this psalm, I focused on the role of metaphor in Bible and in poetry. For in this particular psalm, we have rivers clapping hands and mountains singing joyfully. I just want to make one correction. I actually woke up this morning with a start, with the awareness of a lack of clarity in my introduction regarding abortion. So I just want to clarify it. It will be in the final posting that goes with each of the Psalms, and that is the ellipsis, the missing blank in the story of two men fighting in Exodus, is that it says, if a woman miscarries, because she gets knocked while two men are fighting, and no asson occurs, no harm or no miscarriage occurs, then it's monetary damages. And if it is an asson, a tragedy, harm, then it will be life for life. And what's missing in those verses in Exodus of 21 is no harm to whom? The fetus or the woman. And the way the rabbis understand it, because it's a blank, is that it's harm to the woman, meaning if a miscarriage occurs and the fetus dies, then it's just monetary compensation, and a fetus is not human life. That's how the rabbis understood it, which is to say the enormous possibility of interpretation by how you fill in a blank, which led Augustine in the church to fill in the blank for fetus rather than for mother. And that is one of the key differences in that regard. So that's simply an introduction and a correction to my little introduction for clarification, to say that when we read a psalm like Psalm 98, there will be a need to appreciate the language of poetry, often as metaphor, and in a legal context of reading, to know how words are often ambiguous and gaps can be filled in differently. With that, let me read with you Psalm 98, and then to look together at some of the artistry of the weave and what are some of the takeaways as readers. Psalm 98. Let mountains sing joyfully. A hymn. Sing to Adonai a new song, for God has worked wonders, has given deliverance for God, God's right hand and holy arm. Adonai has made known God's deliverance. For the eyes of the nations, God revealed God's righteousness. God has remembered God's kindness and faithfulness. Chasdo ve'emunato, for the house of Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the deliverance of our God. Shout out to Adonai, all the earth. Burst forth and sing joyfully and hymn. Hymn to Adonai with the lyre and the sound of hymning, with trumpets and the sound of the shofar. Blast before the ruler, Adonai. Let thunder the sea and its fullness, the world and those dwelling in it. Let rivers clap hands together. Let mountains sing joyfully before Adonai. For God comes to judge the earth. God will judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with uprightness. So clearly, the flow of this psalm is that of rejoicing. Shir Chadash, we saw that expression recently, a new song. is understood by the rabbis for being a response to a specific event. In the little Mitsuda, they will say that with deliverance, old songs won't suffice. Hence the need here for a new song. It's not clear what prompts this song in terms of a historic moment for the psalmist, though it was read throughout Jewish history as a song like the Psalms that surround us, that has a messianic feel, a song of celebration when the world will be redeemed by God. The notion that one day, yet ahead, God will judge all the nations of the world, all the nations, for God is the creator of all, and God's creation is unfolding to a new phase of harmony, and God will become manifest. In this opening verse, God has given deliverance with God's right hand and holy arm. That image of God's right hand, Yamino Uzroa, are the same image of the Song of the Sea, the song that the Israelites sang in crossing to freedom, Exodus chapter 15. It's repeated, that phrase, in verse 6, 12, and 16. And the image here might, if you want, refer back to God as the deliverer from Egypt, which also points forward to the Messianic era. If God can enter into history in that Passover story to redeem the Israelites, that right hand and that mighty arm, here a holy arm, God's arm, points to the possibility of God re-entering history again and manifesting redemption. Now, this particular psalm is divided into three parts: 1 to 3, 4 to 6, and 7 to 9. And each of these sections has what it would be called an inclusio, a frame. Section 1, verses 1 to 3, are singing of God's deliverance. And in verse 1, verse 2, and verse 3 is the same reoccurring word, Hoshea, Yeshuato, Yeshuat, all with a little variation, all meaning deliverance. So section 1 is tightly woven to focus in on a song of deliverance. Structurally, verses 4 to 6, section 2, here in verse 4 and verse 6 is a reoccurring word, hariu, like truah, truah, the sound of the shofar blast. Some also translated as shout for joy. So it can either, and in some cases I will use shout for joy as the translation, but here, because it's in the context of musical instruments, a lyre, trumpets, that it seems like the shofar blast is what is evoked. So in verses 4 to 6, here there is celebratory sound, the sound that is using an orchestra. And Robert Alter, in his commentary of his translation to Psalms, will say of verses 4 to 6 that you can imagine that in the time of the temple, there was a whole orchestra performing Psalm 98, and they would make the sounds that will then, in the third section, which is the description of nature's celebration, that they would make sounds like cymbals coming together for the rivers clapping hands, and mountains singing with a chorus of song, And so verses 7 to 9 is this cosmic orchestra. I knew in Santa Ana, I had a good friend who said that the Bible should always be taken literally. So when it describes the mountains dancing or hear rivers clapping hands, he actually took it literally. And I paused because that doesn't seem, as a reader of poetry, to be a move you need to make, but it was one he did make, and others make. Again, in my introduction to this psalm, I share how evangelical leaders at a seminary, when it came to describing how when life begins, took literally an image of Psalms in which God says, I shaped you, as if creation happened by God in the womb. So back to the image of 7 to 9, here we have a metaphor. And the context of the metaphor is the entire cosmos is God's creation, God's handiwork infused by the resonance of God consciousness and more. That we who exist in a world that we see as God's creation. When we listen to the sea and the waves crashing, we can hear that musically. We can hear those waves as crashing and clapping of hands. We can look at the majesty of mountains and experience the mountains in celebration. I shared recently this image of Martin Buber and his theology of I and thou, in which Martin Buber said that the experience of God is in the in-between. And most commonly we experience it with another person, where the other person has value in their own right. They're not an instrument, but have their own wholeness. And in the experience of another person without any agenda, for the fullness, in the fullness of encounter, the in-between is God, the experience of the holy. And he would say in I and Thou, his book, that you can have that same experience with a tree. When you're experiencing the magnificence of a tree, and you're not thinking about how it's useful to you, but rather the tree is, but rather the tree is there.
Go ahead.
Is there simply to be enjoyed, then with a tree, there can be an I-thou experience as well. And so back to the imagery of 7. Let the thunder, the sea, and the fullness, the world, and those dwelling in it. Let the rivers clap hands together. Let mountains sing joyfully. That when we are enveloped and engaged by creation, there too we can experience nature as a conduit to God. We can experience nature as an extension of the wholeness of creation in celebration of God. So back to the beginning, to point out some other little points. The other inclusio of this entire psalm is the word Yud He Vav He. It's at the very beginning, and it is at the end. So one thought, and that is, although this is a psalm of creation, a psalm of universal celebration, the name chosen for God is God's name of covenant with the Israelite people. For again, the context of this song being sung is temple. This is the playlist of the Levites. And in celebration, there is this paradox of being in Jerusalem, praying to Yud He Vav He, and acknowledging Yud He Vav He as the God of the whole of creation. and another reoccurring theme, and that is God's judgment. What is it, the very end, if you will, of this trajectory? What is it that gives cause to celebrate? One, it's the goodness of creation, but God is more than creator. God is more than Aristotle's immovable mover. God is the judge. Here comes the judge, pointing again to an end of days. God will judge the world with righteousness and the people with uprightness. B'tzedek, v'amim b'meisharim, and people with, often translated, equity. But the word yashar in meisharim, this concluding word, is God is straight. God is trustworthy. God will act decisively and with integrity. And that's the twofold nature of God in the Bible and God in Psalms. Magnificent in God's creation, but more righteous in judgment. Now, some of the rabbis were a little uncomfortable with these metaphors, or if you will, tried to concretize them. So Ibn Ezra, who again I'm so fond of, will say, in verse 8, let rivers clap hands. He will share the commentary that what is being referred to here are the sailors clapping hands as they navigate the rivers. So you'll find in the medieval commentators a consistency of seeing this as a celebration at the end of days and simultaneously pulling back and trying to naturalize it. And so when it says the rivers clap, it's the sailors on the rivers navigating. Here's another piece with the word meisharim. The opening of the psalm is Shiru Ladonai Shir Chadash. So you hear in those 4 words in verse 1, sing to Adonai, sing a new song. So Shir and Sharim, you can hear the assonance. So it opens and closes with a similar sound. And more, Sharim, which means straightforwardness or uprightness, Sharim, b'meisharim, sounds like Harim in verse 8, mountains. So the poetry has certain word sounds, assonance, that link verses 8 and 9, Harim and Meisharim, and even the beginning with Shir and the end, Meisharim. Although the words have different roots in this case and different meanings, there is again, to a psalm written in Hebrew, awareness of sound. These psalms were meant to be sung and meant to be heard. Here's another kind of poetic technique. Verse 5, it's ABC, shout to Adonai, all the earth. And then it's CDA, burst forth, sing joyfully, and hymn. And so taking that one verse as an example, Zamru l'Adonai b'chinor, b'chinor v'kol zimra. There's a sense of a structural and circular kind of feel to the notion of an ongoing song. May the song be continuous on some level. Well, because we have a little time, some closing comments and then your reactions. And that is to honor, because it's a short psalm, how the psalm sounds. And so I'm going to read the psalm to convey its quality of rhythm in Hebrew, and then pause for some of your reactions, knowing there's more to share in terms of commentaries. Mizmor, Shiru Ladonai Shir Chadash, Ki Niflaot Asa, Hoshia Lo Yamino, Uzroa Kodsho, Hodia Adonai Yeshuato, Le'nei Hagoyim Gilad Tzidkato, Zachar Chasto Ve'emunato Leveit Yisrael, Ra'u Kol Avsei Aretz Et Yeshuat Eloheinu, Hariu Ladonai Kol Haaretz, Pitzchu V'ranenu V'zameru, Zamru Ladonai Bechinor, Bechinor V'kol Zimra, B'chotzrot V'kol Shofar, Hariu Lifnei HaMelech Adonai, Yiram Hayam Umlo'o, Tevel V'yoshvei Va, Neharot Yimcha'u Chaf, Yachad Harim Yiranenu, Lifnei Adonai, Kiva Lishpot Haaretz, Yishpot Tevel B'tzedek, V'amim B'mei Sharim. With that, as I read it, I hear it being sung. We sing much of this psalm when we present it at Kabbalat Shabbat. It's a song of rejoicing and therefore with music. Any questions or comments about Psalm 98? I got more than one screen here today. Julia, go ahead.
I just wanted to know whether the singing of the mountains could be echoing.
That's a beautiful image that I haven't seen in any of the commentaries, but I'll hold on to it. And namely, we all know, all the more in mountainous settings, that when we sing, it bounces back and is amplified. I love that image. And, combining that with the sounds of rivers and oceans and our own echo, there's truly sound, abundant, lovely. Shula, you have to unmute.
I see in this psalm as much visual as there is auditory, and particularly the last verse where it tells us that all of it, it's like a stage direction. The mountains clapping, the dancing, the trumpets, all this is where? Lifnei Adonai. It is placed before Adonai. And why? Because Adonai is the one most righteous judge. So I see it almost as a beautiful drama, a musical set up Lifnei Adonai to honor and praise Adonai. It is, to me, a glorious visual picture along with the auditory descriptions.
That's delightful, Shula. And I smile because you are so auditory, and yet maybe in part because you're so auditory, you could go beyond it to see, to visualize this as, and all the more as you say, when you were speaking and evoking my visual dimension with verse 9, I was seeing the throngs of people gathering, moving forward amongst all the sound, the sense of coming together for celebration. And as you emphasize, Shula, it's to emphasize the ultimate goodness of God's judgment. And that's what is worthy of celebrating on behalf of creation itself. And once again, this psalm is sung most popularly on Friday night, where our words, the rabbis teach, crown God as sovereign, and where we are given pause on Shabbat to have a foretaste of that future time, to come forward to God, to both appreciate creation's beauty on Shabbat, but also to celebrate God's justice, because that's goodness that is ongoing. Any other Reactions, Marvin?
Rabbi, in this same verse, in the JPS and in the Jerusalem Bible, they use the word rule rather than judge. Now, in the last verse, in verse 9, he will rule the world justly. I like judge better, but I'd like to know why you chose one over the other.
So, to some degree, Marvin asks, which one you're looking at, the Jerusalem Bible?
Yes, yes.
So, a contemporary Christian Bible. Normally, shofet and mishpat are about court and judge, versus, in terms of why I preferred judge to rule, a judge gives a ruling. And so therefore they are synonyms in that regard. A judge gives a judgment or a ruling, but usually rule is more political in how we use it in our own expression. He's the ruler over. He's in charge over, where judge is more about right and wrong per se. So that's why I chose to use the word judge, which is frankly the more common translation, simply because of the noun being shofet, which is judge, versus melech, which is king or ruler, more political than judicial.
It's not the Jerusalem, it's the JPS Bible.
Oh, the JPS, yeah.
Yeah.
So
I agree with you. I prefer the word judge over rule, but I just wanted to, yeah.
So I want to say it with humility. I don't know what the right word is, but what I've become so keenly aware of is that the choices that a translator makes are just that. They're choices, and it's not right or wrong. It's an emphasis for the writer. So JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, is among Jewish scholars the most commonly used or admired translation. So when we in our conservative community had the Eitz Chaim, which is what we use in our synagogue, the translation, the English, which was a step ahead, was using the translation from the Jewish Publication Society, which is based in Philadelphia and known as doing scholarly work. At the same time, as I've been digging deeply into the Psalm translations, I often find that the JPS translations tend to try and be more lyrical than literal. And our sharing, lean toward more the literal rather than interpretive, enabling ambiguity of possibilities rather than solving. And again, that's my critique of JPS, is they often will have a translation that's one step removed from the actual word to kind of make it more fluid.
Yeah, I agree with you. Because the reason I asked the question is because over here, I feel judge is much more correct within the context of the poem.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So I will add a commentary of the Meiri, an important commentator who died in the year 1310. And he will say, relating to Marvin's focus on justice, as long as there is injustice in the world, God is in exile. And so God is coming, back to verse 9, God is coming to judge the earth. The image is God is away. God is in exile, because we live now in a world of injustices. The culmination of creation is a world that is fair, that is just. And that's why God is coming. He's been away. He's been in exile. I just love, again, this essential attribute of justice with God. We'll find more of that tomorrow in Psalm 99 as well. With that, I'm going to give one last, as I stopped a little early, one last comment. And if there's not, I'll pull this together. Anybody else? We have two screens today, so I don't always see. My friend Jack. But Jack has to unmute. And the last Jack, did you learn how to unmute? If not, Jack's coming to us from Seattle, having relocated from Laguna due to a flood, and he's now with his daughter in Seattle. Jack, you got to ask your daughter how to unmute, and then we'll catch you. So for now, Jack, with all regret, I just love having Jack with us when we do come together. So let me just pull this together. In this psalm, God's name is Yud-He Vav-He 6 times and Eloheinu 1 time, which means God's name appears in Psalm 98 7 times. 6 plus 1. And that too is a tool of the poet in Scripture to convey wholeness. This is a psalm that has God with some echo of God as warrior, God at the song of the sea, and yet pointing forward as a shir chadash, a new song, a song that points to a time in which finally God will have entered into the final redemption, in which the world will be a world of justice, and in which God's world in all its dimensions will resonate in God's presence, and it will be as if the whole world is singing in harmony. The rivers, the mountains, at least as experienced by humanity, there will be a shir chadash, a new song of cosmic orchestra. And so with that, I pause and catch my breath, because in this world, my teacher, Rabbi Simon Greenberg, Zal, said regarding creation, that after each days of creation, God looks and says, it is good. And day 6, it's very good. But Rabbi Greenberg said, God never said it was perfect. It's an incomplete world. And the greatest religious challenge, Rabbi Greenberg said, is looking at an imperfect world and being able to say, like God did, it is good, despite brokenness. And so as we honor Noah and the life that his life that was cut short too early, we acknowledge that in this world there is incompleteness. And with that, my friend Harris, some words to honor Noah, and then a Kaddish together.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to very briefly share 2 observations about this 30-day period of Shloshim. First, because the mourning period ends after 1 month, rather than 11 months for a parent, I'm finding the end of the mourning even more difficult than the beginning, as this has ended too fast. Number 2, during these past few weeks, I've spent time reading through my text exchanges with Noah. While most photos are of special occasions, text messages are largely about everyday things, what we're doing, how we feel, who we were with yesterday, etc. In other words, text messages are snapshots of our everyday life. And at this time, these provide me with a closeness to my son. Thank you.
Thank you, Harris, and to you and to Jan, condolences. As you traditionally, a part of a day is a whole day, which means that one ends one's morning after the morning prayers, or in this case, after the study of the morning. So with this Kaddish, you will be formally ending the 30 days, the Shloshim, of honoring of Noah. And so I invite those saying Kaddish in honor of a loved one to join together as we honor our loved ones. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabba Alma Yidra Kirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechom yomechom uv'chaye dekol beit Yisrael ba'agalav ubizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam omei omaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dikutra berichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushkachata v'nechemata da'amiran bi'alma imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. You, Harris, shared with me a teaching on Kaddish that you got from Eli Confort, which is that one reason Kaddish is recited is to fill in the missing light for God, that each person's life is a light, and God too feels the loss. May you, Harris and Jan, may Noah's memory continue to be a light for you in all of life. To each of you, thank you for joining today. Psalm 99 tomorrow. Exalt Adonai, our God. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu. So we'll hear more song, which will be the fifth and final of the Kabbalah before the Friday Psalm 28, which we studied. I look forward to continuing our Kabbalah Shabbat on Thursday morning. All the best. Thank you. Have a good day.